Did Julius Caesar really say Veni, Vidi, Vici, the truth behind history's most famous quote? Everything you think you know about Julius Caesar's legendary quote might be completely wrong. And the real story is way more complicated than what your history teacher told you. So yeah, Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 words that have echoed through over 2,000 years of history. It's one of those quotes that just sounds so badass that you want it to be true. But here's the thing. Did Caesar actually say it? And if he did, was it really in the context we've been taught? Let me tell you, the answer is going to surprise you, because what actually happened is far more interesting than the myth itself. I'm going to walk you through the real historical evidence, show you what ancient sources actually tell us, and reveal why this quote became so famous in the first place. By the end of this video, you'll know more about this phrase than most history professors, and you'll understand why the truth matters more than the legend. Now, before we dive into the evidence, we need to understand who Julius Caesar really was. Not the Hollywood version, not the Shakespeare character, but the actual historical figure. Because context is everything here. Caesar lived from 100 BC to 44 BC, and he was basically the guy who transformed Rome from a republic into what would become an empire. He was a military genius, a brilliant politician, and someone who understood the power of public relations better than almost anyone in ancient history. This last part is crucial, so keep it in mind. See, Caesar wasn't just a general who won battles. He was a brand. He knew how to craft his image, how to make himself look good, and how to spread his message across the Roman world. He wrote his own accounts of his military campaigns, which is like if a modern general wrote their own Wikipedia page while the battles were still happening. So when we talk about whether Caesar said something, we have to remember that this guy was a master of propaganda and self-promotion. Now let's get to the actual quote and where it supposedly came from. According to traditional history, Caesar said, Veni, Vidi, Vici, after the Battle of Zela in 47 BC. This was a battle in what's now modern-day Turkey, where Caesar defeated Pharnaces II, the king of Pontus. And yeah, Caesar absolutely destroyed this guy. The battle was so quick and decisive that it became legendary. But here's where things get interesting. We actually have ancient sources that mention this quote. The most important ones are the Roman historians Suetonius and Plutarch, both of whom wrote about Caesar's life decades after his death. And here's what they tell us. Suetonius, writing around 120 AD, which is about 165 years after Caesar's death, says that Caesar displayed these 3 words in his triumph celebration in Rome. Not that he shouted them on the battlefield, but that he showed them as part of his victory parade. The words were apparently written on a placard or banner that was carried through the streets of Rome as part of the celebration. Plutarch, who was writing around the same time, gives us a slightly different version. He says that Caesar wrote these words in a letter to his friend Amintius back in Rome, describing how quickly and easily he had won the battle. So according to Plutarch, it wasn't something Caesar shouted dramatically while looking over a battlefield. It was more like a text message bragging about how easy the fight was. Now, do you see the problem here? Both of these historians were writing more than a century and a half after the event supposedly happened. That's like someone today writing about what happened in the American Civil War based on oral tradition and old documents. Could they get it right? Sure, but there's definitely room for error, exaggeration, or just plain making stuff up. Let me put this in perspective for you. Imagine if the only records we had of something a president said in the 1860s came from books written in the 2020s, and those books were based on stories that had been passed down for generations. You'd be pretty skeptical, right? You'd want to know what the original sources said, and that's exactly the problem we face with Caesar. So did Caesar actually say or write these words? Well, the honest answer is that we can't be 100% sure, but here's what we can say with confidence. First, both Suetonius and Plutarch were respected historians who had access to records and documents that we don't have today. They weren't just making things up out of nowhere. Second, the quote fits perfectly with what we know about Caesar's personality and his love of dramatic, memorable phrases. And third, there doesn't seem to be any reason why these historians would invent this specific quote about this specific battle. But let's dig deeper into why this quote makes sense for this particular battle. The Battle of Zela wasn't just any victory, it was an incredibly fast and decisive one. Caesar had actually been dealing with a bunch of problems in Egypt before this, and he needed to quickly handle this situation in Pontus before moving on to other issues. According to ancient accounts, the battle lasted only 4 hours from start to finish. 4 hours. That's shorter than a typical work meeting. Pharnaces thought he had the advantage because his army was positioned on high ground, and he actually attacked Caesar's forces while they were still setting up camp. Big mistake. Caesar's troops were so well trained and experienced that they just adapted immediately, counterattacked, and completely destroyed Pharnaces' army before lunchtime. It was such a quick victory that it must have felt almost ridiculous. So when you think about it, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, is actually the perfect summary of what happened. It's not just bragging, it's an accurate description delivered in the most efficient way possible. 3 words in Latin, each with just 2 syllables. It's memorable, it's punchy, and it captures the speed and ease of the victory. From a propaganda perspective, it's absolutely brilliant. And this is where we need to talk about Caesar's writing style because it's actually really important. Caesar was famous for writing in a very clear, direct, and simple style. His military commentaries, which still survive today, are known for being straightforward and easy to understand. He didn't use flowery language or complicated sentences. He got straight to the point. So a 3-word summary of a military campaign, that's totally in character for him. There's also something else we need to consider. In ancient Rome, triumph celebrations were a huge deal. When a general won a significant victory, he could be granted a triumph by the Senate, which was basically a massive parade through Rome where he'd show off his prisoners, his loot, and his achievements. These celebrations were carefully choreographed propaganda events designed to boost the general's reputation and remind everyone how awesome Rome was. Caesar's triumph in 46 BC, which celebrated multiple victories including the one at Zela, was one of the most elaborate in Roman history. It lasted several days and included 4 separate processions. During these celebrations, it was common to display placards with information about the victories, where they happened, who was defeated, how much treasure was captured, that kind of thing. So displaying Veni, Vidi, Vici on a banner, that fits perfectly with how these events worked. Now here's something that might blow your mind. Even if Caesar did say or write these exact words, the phrase might not have had the same impact in Latin that it does in English. In Latin, there's a poetic quality to the phrase because all 3 words start with the same letter and have the same structure. It's called alliteration, and it makes the phrase catchy and memorable. But Latin speakers were used to this kind of wordplay. It might have been clever, but it wasn't necessarily mind-blowing. The phrase really gained its legendary status later, especially during the Renaissance when people became obsessed with classical Rome and started using Latin phrases to sound educated and sophisticated. That's when Veni, Vidi, Vici became the quote to use when you wanted to sound powerful and successful. Everyone from kings to artists to military leaders started referencing it. It became divorced from its original context and turned into this universal symbol of quick, decisive victory. Let's also talk about the other famous quotes attributed to Caesar, because this gives us more context. You know, the die is cast, which he supposedly said when crossing the Rubicon River, or et tu, Brute, from Shakespeare's play. Well, here's the thing. Shakespeare definitely made up that last one, and the die is cast is probably a paraphrase or translation of something Caesar said, but we don't know the exact words. The point is, ancient history is full of quotes that might be accurate, might be paraphrased, might be completely invented, or might be something in between. We have to evaluate each one based on the evidence, and for Veni, Vidi, Vici, the evidence is actually pretty good compared to most ancient quotes. We have multiple ancient sources mentioning it. We have a specific context that makes sense. We have a quote that fits the historical figure's personality and style, and we don't have any ancient sources contradicting it or offering alternative versions. That's actually a lot better than most things we think we know about ancient history. But here's something really important that often gets overlooked in discussions about this quote. Whether or not Caesar said these exact words matters less than what the quote tells us about Roman culture and values. The fact that this phrase became legendary tells us what Romans admired: speed, efficiency, decisiveness, confidence. These were the qualities that Romans valued in their leaders. Caesar embodied those qualities, and this quote captured them perfectly. Think about it from Caesar's perspective for a second. He's in the middle of multiple military and political challenges. He just finished dealing with a civil war and complicated situations in Egypt. He needs to quickly solve this problem in Pontus and move on to the next crisis. He shows up, handles the situation in less than a day, and then finds a way to sum it up that makes him look incredibly capable and efficient. Whether he came up with the phrase on the spot, wrote it later in a letter, or had it crafted for his triumph celebration, it served its purpose perfectly. There's also a darker side to this story that doesn't get talked about much. When we celebrate these three simple words, we're celebrating a military conquest where thousands of people probably died. Pharnaces' army was destroyed, his kingdom was taken over, and countless soldiers on both sides never went home. The phrase makes it sound almost casual, like Caesar just walked in and solved a problem. But behind those three words was violence, death, and the complete destruction of an army. This doesn't mean Caesar was worse than other ancient military leaders. They all operated in a brutal world where conquest was normal. But it's worth remembering that our legendary quotes often gloss over some pretty dark realities. The efficiency that we admire in Veni, Vidi, Vici meant that Caesar was really good at killing people quickly. Now let's address some of the alternative theories and skeptical arguments. Some historians have pointed out that we only have sources from more than a century after the event, which is a valid concern. Others note that Roman historians sometimes invented speeches and quotes to make their narratives more dramatic and engaging. This was actually an accepted practice in ancient historiography. If a historian thought a quote captured the essence of what someone would have said, they might include it even if they didn't have a direct source. But here's the counter-argument. If Suetonius or Plutarch were just making up quotes to spice up their stories, why would they choose this particular battle and this particular phrase? Zela wasn't even Caesar's most important victory. That would be something like Alesia during the Gallic Wars or Pharsalus during the civil war against Pompey. If you're going to invent a legendary quote, you'd probably attach it to a more significant event. The fact that Veni, Vidi, Vici is connected to a relatively minor victory actually makes it more believable. It suggests that there was a genuine tradition or record connecting Caesar to this phrase in this context. And remember, these historians were writing for Roman audiences who would have been familiar with Caesar's military campaigns. If they just invented something that contradicted well-known facts, their credibility would have been destroyed. Another point worth considering is that we actually have fragments and references to earlier sources that mention Caesar's campaigns. Not all ancient writings survived to the present day. In fact, most of them didn't. But we know that there were many books and records that existed in the 1st century AD that are now lost. Suetonius and Plutarch would have had access to sources that we don't. So when they mention something specific like this quote, they might be drawing on records that were much closer to the original events. Let's also talk about why this matters today. Why should we care whether some Roman general actually said 3 specific words over 2,000 years ago? Well, beyond just historical accuracy, it's about understanding how history gets transmitted, transformed, and mythologized. Every famous quote, every legendary story, every historical fact we think we know went through a similar process. Some details got preserved accurately, others got exaggerated, and some got completely made up. Understanding this process makes us better critical thinkers. When someone tells you that a famous person said something, you should ask, what's the source? How close to the event was it recorded? Does it fit with what we know about that person? Are there alternative versions? These are the same questions historians ask about ancient sources, but they're also the questions we should ask about modern claims. The truth about Veni, Vidi, Vici is probably something like this. Caesar either said, wrote, or displayed something very close to these words in connection with his victory at Zela. The phrase was remembered because it was catchy and because it perfectly captured both the nature of the victory and Caesar's personality. It got passed down through historical records, maybe getting slightly polished or refined along the way until it was recorded by historians like Suetonius and Plutarch. Then it became legendary during the Renaissance and has remained famous ever since. Is that the exciting answer where I tell you it's definitely real or definitely fake? No, but it's honest and it's based on the actual evidence we have. History isn't always about certainty. It's often about probabilities and making the best conclusions we can based on incomplete information. So the next time someone asks you if Caesar really said Veni, Vidi, Vici, you can tell them that according to our best historical sources, yes, he probably did say or write something very close to those words. And you can explain that, while we can't be absolutely certain because we're looking back over 2,000 years, the evidence is actually pretty solid. More importantly, you can explain why the quote became legendary and what it tells us about Roman values and Caesar's genius for self-promotion. The myth isn't that Caesar said these words. The myth is that we know exactly how and when he said them, or that the quote somehow captures the entire essence of who he was. Caesar was way more complicated than 3 words could ever express. He was brilliant and ruthless, charismatic and calculating, a military genius and a destroyer of the Roman Republic. 3 words can't sum up a life that changed the course of Western civilization, but those 3 words can give us a glimpse into how Caesar wanted to be seen and how he successfully crafted an image that lasted for over 2 millennia. In that sense, Veni, Vidi, Vici is absolutely real, regardless of the specific historical details. It's real because it shaped how people thought about Caesar then, and how we think about him now. It's real because it became part of our culture and language, and it's real because it teaches us something about power, propaganda, and the stories we tell about our leaders. History isn't just about what actually happened. It's also about what people believed happened, what they wanted to believe, and how those beliefs shaped the world. Caesar understood this better than almost anyone in ancient history. Whether or not he stood on a battlefield or sat in a tent or marched through Rome saying or displaying these specific words, he definitely understood the power of a good quote. And that understanding helped make him immortal. If you want to see more myths about famous historical figures get destroyed, hit that subscribe button. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.